Mercer Farm in rural Nebraska. None of them ever walked out. For 36 years, their disappearance remained one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in the Midwest. But when a severe drought exposed something buried deep in the dried creek bed, a retired sheriff would be forced to confront the horrifying truth about what really happened that day. And the answer would shatter everything the town of Ashford thought it knew about the Mercer family. This is the story of the vanishing at Mercer Farm. If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unsolved disappearances, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what happens next. The cornfield stretched endlessly under the July sun, the stalks reaching nearly 8 feet high, swaying in the hot Nebraska wind. Sarah Holcomb stood at the edge of the field, her hand shielding her eyes as she squinted into the green maze. She was 12 years old, the oldest of the cousins gathered at Mercer Farm that summer afternoon. Behind her, the sounds of the family reunion drifted across the yard. Adults laughed around picnic tables, children shrieked as they played tag near the barn, and somewhere a radio played country music, the smell of barbecue smoke mixed with the earthy scent of growing corn. "Come on, Sarah," her cousin Danny called from beside her. He was 10, lean and sunburned, impatient in the way only 10-year-old boys could be. "You're not scared, are you?" The other two cousins, Emma and Michael, stood waiting. Emma was 9, quiet and careful, holding her stuffed rabbit even in the summer heat. Michael, only 7, clutched a toy compass their grandfather had given him that morning. Sarah looked back at the farmhouse one last time. Her mother was visible through the kitchen window, washing dishes alongside Aunt Linda. Uncle Robert was flipping burgers on the grill, beer in hand. No one was watching them. No one ever really watched them at these reunions. "It's just a game," Danny insisted, his voice carrying a challenge. "Hide and seek in the corn. What's the big deal?" Sarah turned back to the field. The stalks seemed to whisper secrets to each other, rustling in a language she couldn't quite understand. Something about the cornfield felt wrong today, felt darker than usual, but she couldn't explain it. She was 12. She wasn't supposed to believe in feelings anymore. "Fine," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But we stick together. Nobody goes off alone." Danny grinned. That wild grin that always meant trouble was coming. Emma hugged her rabbit closer. Michael checked his compass one more time, the needle spinning lazily until it settled, pointing north. They stepped into the corn. The green walls swallowed them immediately, the stalks closing behind like a curtain falling. The sounds of the reunion faded to distant murmurs. The air grew thick and close, heavy with the smell of earth and growing things. Sarah led the way, pushing through the narrow rows, the leaves scratching at her bare arms. "How far are we going?" Emma asked, her voice small. "Just to the middle," Sarah replied. "Then we'll head back." But the middle of the field never came. They walked and walked, the corn pressing in from all sides, identical rows stretching in every direction. Michael kept checking his compass, frowning at the needle that now spun uselessly, unable to settle on any direction. "Something's wrong," he whispered. That's when they heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a cornfield. A low, mechanical hum, coming from somewhere beneath their feet. Sarah stopped walking, her cousins bumping into her from behind. "Do you hear that?" she asked. They all heard it, and they all felt it too. A vibration in the ground, subtle but growing stronger. Emma started to cry, clutching her rabbit. Michael's compass needle spun faster and faster, as if caught in an invisible whirlwind. "We should go back," Sarah said, turning around. But the corn had changed. The rows they'd walked through moments ago were gone, replaced by walls of stalks that seemed taller, darker, more tightly packed. Sarah pushed forward anyway, pulling her cousins with her, but the corn wouldn't let them pass. It bent and twisted, blocking their path. The humming grew louder, and then the ground beneath them began to crack. The drought of 2023 was the worst Nebraska had seen in 70 years. By late August, the Ashford Creek had shrunk to barely a trickle, exposing rocky bed that hadn't seen sunlight since the Dust Bowl. Farmers watched their crops wither. Cattle stood listless in brown pastures, and in the dried mud of the creek bed, a morning jogger named Patricia Voss found something that would bring Detective Raymond Cole out of retirement. Patricia had been running the creek trail for 15 years, ever since her doctor told her she needed to lose weight or risk a heart attack. She knew every bend, every landmark, every tree along the route, which is why she noticed immediately when something white protruded from the cracked earth near the old Mercer property line. At first, she thought it was a rock. Creek bed was full of limestone chunks, pushed up by decades of spring flooding. But as she got closer, slowing to a walk, she realized the white object had a shape that made her stomach turn. It was smooth, curved, with dark hollows that looked too much like eyes. Patricia stood there for a long moment, her running shoes sinking slightly into the dry mud, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with exercise. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. Raymond Cole heard about the discovery 3 hours later, sitting in his recliner, watching a rerun of a baseball game he'd already seen twice. His daughter called, her voice tight, with something he recognized from 30 years of police work. "Dad, they found bones at Mercer Creek." Raymond muted the television, the baseball game suddenly meaningless. "Human? They think so. County coroner is on the way." "Dad, the location, it's right where—" "I know where it is, Jenny." After he hung up, Raymond sat very still in his recliner, staring at the blank television screen. 36 years. He'd been a young deputy then, only 28 years old, barely a year on the force. The disappearance of the 4 Mercer cousins had been his first major case. It had also been his first failure. The images came back unbidden. Sarah Holcomb's mother collapsed on the farmhouse porch, screaming her daughter's name until her voice gave out. Danny Mitchell's father, organizing search parties that combed every inch of that cornfield, the desperation in his eyes growing with each empty hour. Emma's parents, holding each other in the police station, unable to speak, unable to cry, unable to do anything but wait for news that never came. And little Michael's grandmother, who'd sat in the same chair in the station lobby for 3 days straight, refusing to leave, convinced her grandson would walk through the door any moment. Raymond had searched that cornfield himself, along with 200 volunteers, 3 canine units, and a helicopter with thermal imaging. They'd searched for 2 weeks straight, then sporadically for months after. They'd found nothing. No trace, no evidence, no sign that 4 children had ever been there at all. The corn had simply swallowed them whole. Now, 36 years later, the drought had given them up. Raymond pushed himself out of the recliner, his knees protesting the movement. He was 64 now, officially retired for 2 years, but the badge still sat in his drawer upstairs. He'd kept it, even though they'd given him a replacement at his retirement ceremony. The old one felt right in his hands, worn smooth by decades of carrying it. He drove to Mercer Creek in his pickup truck, following roads he could navigate blindfolded. The Mercer Farm was abandoned now, had been for 20 years. Old man Mercer had sold it after his wife died, unable to bear living in the place where his grandchildren had vanished. The new owners, a young couple from Omaha, had tried to make a go of it for a few years before giving up and moving back to the city. Since then, the property had sat empty, The farmhouse slowly collapsing, the barn leaning precariously, the cornfields gone to seed and weeds. Crime scene tape cordoned off a section of the creek bed. Raymond parked his truck and walked down the slope, his old police instincts taking over. Two sheriff's deputies stood near the excavation site, along with the county coroner, Dr. Helen Marsh, who looked up as Raymond approached. "Ray," she said, her voice professionally neutral, "I wondered if you'd show up. Couldn't stay away." He peered into the shallow hole they'd dug around the protruding bone. "What have we got?" Dr. Marsh knelt beside the excavation, her gloved hands carefully brushing away loose dirt. "Preliminary examination suggests juvenile remains. Age approximately 7 to 12. I'll know more once we get them back to the lab." "One body or more?" She looked up at him, her eyes serious behind her glasses. "Raymond, I've uncovered portions of 3 separate skulls so far, and we've only excavated about 6 square feet." Raymond felt the ground tilt beneath him, the August sun suddenly too hot, the air too thick. 3 bodies, maybe 4. After 36 years of wondering, of lying awake at night, thinking about those children, of attending memorial services where they buried empty caskets, here was the answer. Not the answer anyone wanted, but an answer nonetheless. "How long before you know for certain?" he asked. "Days, maybe weeks. We need to excavate carefully, document everything." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Ray, there's something else. The bones. They're arranged in a pattern, deliberately positioned. This wasn't just bodies dumped in a creek bed." Raymond looked at the exposed earth, at the carefully cordoned crime scene, at the creek that had finally given up its secrets after decades of drought. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, the sound harsh and lonely across the empty farmland. "I need to see the Mercer property," he said. Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. "I thought you might. The current owner gave permission for us to access the land. Raymond, if you're going back there, be careful. That place—" She stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "There's something off about it. Always has been." Raymond knew exactly what she meant. He'd felt it 36 years ago, walking through that cornfield, searching for 4 missing children. The land itself had felt wrong, infected with something dark and patient. He'd chalked it up to stress, to the horror of missing children, to his own inexperience. But the feeling had never left him, not in all the years since. Now, he was going back. The driveway to Mercer Farm was overgrown with weeds, cracked asphalt, giving way to dirt and gravel. Raymond's truck bounced over the ruts, kicking up dust that hung in the still air. The farmhouse came into view slowly, emerging from the wild growth, like something from a nightmare. It had been white once, with green shutters and a wraparound porch where the family used to sit on summer evenings. Now the paint peeled in long strips, the shutters hung crooked or had fallen off entirely, and the porch sagged dangerously, several boards missing to reveal the dark crawl space beneath. The windows were intact, but so dirty they appeared black, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. Raymond parked near the old barn and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, gathering his courage. He'd been back to this property exactly once, since 1987, 5 years after the disappearance, when the Mercers finally sold. He'd walked the land one last time, hoping to find something everyone else had missed. He'd found nothing but that same creeping sense of wrongness, of something watching from just beyond sight. The feeling was stronger now. He climbed out of the truck, the afternoon sun beating down on his shoulders. The cornfield where the children had vanished was gone, replaced by an expanse of dried grass and scattered volunteer stalks. But he could still picture it in his mind, 8 feet tall, green and rustling, hiding secrets that had taken 36 years to surface. Raymond walked toward the farmhouse, his boots crunching on the dry grass. The front steps groaned under his weight, but held. The door stood slightly ajar, the lock broken years ago by vandals or vagrants. He pushed it open with one finger, the hinges screaming in protest. The interior was dim and thick with dust. Afternoon light filtered through the filthy windows, illuminating particles that swirled in the disturbed air. The living room was empty, except for a single overturned chair and water-stained wallpaper peeling from the walls. Graffiti covered one wall, teenage declarations of love and crude drawings, but nothing sinister. He moved through the house slowly, methodically, checking each room. The kitchen still had cabinets, though the doors hung open, revealing empty shelves. The dining room was bare. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms sat empty, their hardwood floors covered in debris and leaves blown in through broken window screens. Nothing, just an abandoned farmhouse, slowly returning to the earth. Raymond descended the stairs and stood in the front hallway, frustrated. What had he expected to find? The children hadn't vanished from the house. They'd gone into the cornfield and never come out. The investigation had focused on the field, on the surrounding woods, on the creek. They'd interviewed every person at the reunion, every neighbor, every stranger who'd been seen in the area. They'd checked sex offender registries, followed up on rumors, investigated the parents themselves with the cold thoroughness as required in such cases. The FBI had taken over after the first week, bringing resources the local sheriff's department couldn't match. They'd found nothing either. Eventually, the case went cold, filed away with thousands of other missing persons reports. The families held memorial services. Life moved on, though it never really moved forward for those who'd lost children that day. Raymond walked to the back door, which opened onto what had once been a large yard, separating the house from the barn. The barn itself leaned precipitously to one side, its red paint long faded to a mottled gray. The doors stood open, revealing darkness inside. He crossed the yard, each step requiring conscious effort. His instincts, honed by 3 decades of police work, were screaming at him to turn around, to get back in his truck, to leave this place to its ghosts. But he'd lived with those ghosts for 36 years. If there were answers to be found, he owed it to those families to find them. The barn's interior smelled of rotted hay and animal droppings. Pigeons scattered from the rafters as Raymond entered, their wings beating against the close air. Light streamed through gaps in the walls, creating bars of gold in the dusty darkness. An old tractor sat rusting in one corner. Hay bales, ancient and decomposing, were stacked against the far wall. Raymond walked the perimeter, examining everything, finding nothing. He was about to leave when his boot caught on something, nearly sending him sprawling. He looked down, expecting to see a board or piece of farming equipment. Instead, he found a metal ring set flush with the floor, covered by years of dirt and hay. Raymond knelt, his heart suddenly pounding. He brushed away the debris, revealing a trapdoor approximately 4 feet square. The wood was old but solid, reinforced with metal bands. There was no lock, just the ring to lift it by. In 36 years of investigating this property, no one had ever mentioned a trapdoor in the barn. Raymond pulled out his phone and called Jenny. "I need you to run something through the property records," he said when she answered. "Mercer Farm. Original blueprints and surveys. I need to know if there were any underground structures on the property." "Underground? Dad, what did you find?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." He stared at the trapdoor, at the rusted ring, at the darkness waiting below. "I'll call you back." Raymond ended the call and stood over the trapdoor for a long moment. Every instinct told him to wait, to call for backup, to get a warrant and a team of investigators. But those instincts warred with something else, something that had driven him for 36 years. The need to know, the need to finally understand what had happened to those children. He gripped the metal ring and pulled. The trapdoor opened with a groan of protesting hinges, revealing a wooden ladder descending into absolute darkness. A smell wafted up, cold and damp, like a cellar that had been sealed for decades. Raymond pulled out his flashlight and shone it down the shaft. The ladder descended about 15 feet to what appeared to be a dirt floor. The flashlight beam couldn't penetrate far into the space below, but Raymond could make out walls, possibly concrete, and what might be a tunnel leading away from the base of the ladder. He should wait. He knew he should wait. Instead, he tested the ladder's top rung with his weight. It held. He descended slowly, each step creaking ominously, expecting at any moment for the ancient wood to snap and send him plummeting into the darkness below. The air grew colder as he descended, the smell stronger. It wasn't quite rot, wasn't quite earth. It was something else, something Raymond couldn't identify. His boots touched solid ground, and he stepped off the ladder, sweeping his flashlight in a wide arc. He was standing in a concrete tunnel, approximately 6 feet high and 5 feet wide. The walls were rough but deliberate, clearly man-made. The tunnel extended in both directions, disappearing into darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. Overhead, thick wooden beams supported the ceiling, some showing signs of rot, but appearing disturbingly solid. Someone had built this. Someone had built it deliberately, secretly, and maintained it well enough that it had survived for decades beneath the Mercer barn. Raymond chose a direction at random and began walking, his flashlight beam dancing across the concrete walls. After about 30 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter. Raymond stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. The chamber was furnished. A metal cot stood against one wall, its mattress long rotted away. Shelves lined another wall, empty now, except for a few rusted cans. In the center of the room sat a wooden table and 2 chairs, one tipped over on its side, and on the walls, covering every available surface, were drawings. Raymond approached slowly, his flashlight revealing images that made his stomach turn. Stick figures, crude but unmistakable. 4 of them, always 4, and around them other shapes. Adults, larger and darker, surrounding the smaller figures. Some drawings showed the stick figures in cages, others showed them lying down, still or sleeping, or something worse. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the flashlight's beam, something else caught Raymond's attention. He moved closer, his hand unconsciously moving to where his service weapon used to rest on his hip. It was a stuffed animal, a rabbit, small and tattered, its fur matted with decades of dirt and moisture. Raymond's hand trembled as he reached for it, then stopped. This was a crime scene. He couldn't contaminate it, but he didn't need to touch the rabbit to know what it was. He'd seen it in dozens of photographs, clutched in the arms of a 9-year-old girl named Emma Pierce. She'd been holding it when she walked into the cornfield 36 years ago. Raymond backed out of the chamber slowly, his flashlight beam locked on the stuffed rabbit, as if it might disappear if he looked away. His phone had no signal underground, which meant climbing back up that ladder, which meant turning his back on what he'd found. Every cop instinct he'd ever developed told him not to leave this room unobserved, but he had no choice. The climb up felt longer than the descent. His hands shook on the ladder rungs, whether from adrenaline or the weight of 36 years of failure finally lifting, he couldn't tell. When he emerged into the barn, The afternoon sunlight seemed offensively bright, the ordinary sounds of birds and wind, obscene in their normalcy. His phone showed 2 bars. He called Jenny first, then Sheriff Miller, then Dr. Marsh. Within 40 minutes, the barn was swarming with personnel. Crime scene techs, deputies, the county coroner's team, even a structural engineer, to assess whether the underground chamber was safe to occupy. Raymond watched from outside as they set up lights and began the careful process of documenting everything he'd found. Dr. Marsh emerged from the barn 3 hours later, her face pale despite her professional composure. She found Raymond sitting on the tailgate of his truck, drinking coffee from a thermos he'd retrieved from behind his seat. "Ray," she said quietly, "you need to see something." He followed her back into the barn, down the ladder that now had safety equipment and portable lights illuminating every inch. The underground chamber looked different with proper lighting, smaller somehow, more squalid. The drawings on the walls were clearer now, more detailed and more disturbing. The stick figures showed progression, a timeline of captivity drawn by someone, perhaps the children themselves. But Dr. Marsh led him past the main chamber, to the tunnel he hadn't fully explored, the one leading away from the ladder. It extended for nearly 100 feet before branching into 3 smaller rooms. 2 were empty, except for more drawings on the walls. The third contained a workbench with tools, all rusted now, and a large metal box bolted to the floor. "We haven't opened it yet," Dr. Marsh said. "Waiting for your call on whether we need a warrant." "Property's abandoned," Raymond said. "Owner gave permission for access. Open it?" One of the techs used bolt cutters on the padlock, which snapped easily after decades of rust. The lid lifted with a metallic groan. Inside were clothes. Small clothes, children's sizes, neatly folded and preserved in plastic bags. Raymond recognized them immediately from photographs he'd memorized 36 years ago. Sarah's denim shorts with the patch on the knee, Danny's red Cardinals t-shirt, Emma's sundress with yellow flowers, Michael's tiny sneakers with Velcro straps. Beneath the clothes were other items: a compass, the needle still trying to find north, a small notebook filled with a child's handwriting, pages and pages of the same phrase, repeated over and over. "We want to go home. We want to go home. We want to go home." At the very bottom of the box now lay 4 photographs, Polaroids faded but still visible. Raymond picked up the first one with gloved hands. It showed 4 children sitting on the metal cot in the main chamber, their faces empty of expression, their eyes dead. The date stamp in the corner read, August 15th, 1987, 2 weeks after they'd disappeared. The second photo was dated September 3rd, 1987. 3 children this time, the smallest one missing. The third photo, October 12th, 1987. 2 children. The fourth photo, December 24th, 1987. 1 child, sitting alone on the cot, staring at the camera with eyes that had seen things no child should ever see. Raymond's hands trembled as he set the photos down on the workbench. "We need to identify which child survived," he said, his voice not sounding like his own. "Already on it," Dr. Marsh replied. "But Ray, there's something else you need to know. The bones we found in the creek bed, the preliminary analysis shows trauma consistent with, well, with ritual arrangement, and there's evidence of," she paused, choosing words carefully, "of anatomical study. Someone dissected those children post-mortem. Carefully, methodically." Raymond closed his eyes, and the barn suddenly too close, too hot, too full of ghosts. "Who did this, Helen? Who built these tunnels?" "Record search came back an hour ago," Dr. Marsh said. "The underground space was originally built in 1952 by Harrison Mercer, the grandfather, listed in the permit applications as a storm shelter and cold storage. But the modifications, the separate chambers, the reinforced doors, that all came later. We found evidence of construction work dating from the late 1970s through the mid-1980s. Harrison Mercer died in 1991. Raymond said, the pieces starting to fall into place 4 years after the children disappeared. His son, Thomas Mercer, owned the farm at the time of the disappearance. Dr. Marsh continued. He's the one who sold the property in 1992. He moved to Colorado, works as an accountant. We've got people trying to locate him now. Raymond thought back to 1987, to the investigation, to the family reunion where 4 children had vanished. Thomas Mercer had been there that day, had been one of the first people interviewed. He'd seemed devastated, cooperative, desperate to help. He'd joined the search parties, had his property torn apart by investigators, had allowed every intrusion without complaint. Raymond had interviewed him personally, 3 separate times. He'd never mentioned underground chambers beneath the barn. A tech descended the ladder, calling out to Dr. Marsh. We've got something in the North Branch. Looks like personal effects, lots of them. And, you should probably see this yourself. They followed the tech down a narrow offshoot of the main tunnel, one that required walking single file, the walls pressing close enough to brush their shoulders. It opened into a space no larger than a closet. Shelves lined all 3 walls, and on those shelves sat dozens of items, each carefully labeled with masking tape and faded ink. Raymond's flashlight beam traveled across the labels. Sarah H., hair sample; Danny M., fingernail clippings; Emma P., baby tooth; Michael T., blood sample. But those weren't the only names. The shelves held hundreds of samples, going back decades. Names Raymond didn't recognize, dates stretching back to the 1950s, each sample meticulously collected, cataloged, preserved. Good God, Dr. Marsh whispered. How many victims are we looking at? Raymond counted the names visible in his flashlight beam. 23. And those were just the ones he could see. The shelves extended back into darkness, holding God knew how many more secrets. His phone buzzed, making him jump. Signal must have somehow penetrated this deep. Or maybe they'd strung a line from above. Jenny's text was brief. Found Thomas Mercer, Colorado Springs. Local PD making contact now. Dad, there's something you need to know about the Mercer family. Call me. Raymond climbed back to the surface, his legs aching, his head pounding. The sun was setting now, painting the abandoned farm in shades of orange and red. He called Jenny, putting her on speaker. Dad, I pulled everything I could find on the Mercers, she said without preamble. Harrison Mercer, the grandfather, he was a doctor. Practiced in Ashford from 1948 until his death. General practitioner, well respected. What kind of doctor, Jenny? That's the thing. He started as a general practitioner, but his records show he had a particular interest in childhood development and behavioral psychology. And Dad, there's more. Harrison had a brother, Eugene Mercer, who was institutionalized in 1953 for nervous exhaustion. I found the admission papers. Eugene claimed Harrison was conducting experiments, something about genetic inheritance and behavioral conditioning. Nobody believed him. He died in the institution in 1967. Raymond watched the crime scene techs moving in and out of the barn like worker ants, carrying evidence boxes, setting up more lights. What happened to Thomas Mercer's children? Did he have any? No children, never married. He left Ashford in 1992 and never came back. But here's what's interesting. Harrison Mercer's medical practice closed immediately after the children disappeared. He retired, sold his clinic, moved into the farmhouse with Thomas. They lived there together until Harrison died in 1991. Then Thomas sold and left. They knew, Raymond said softly. They both knew what was in those tunnels. Dad, Colorado PD just reported in. Thomas Mercer is dead. Suicide. Approximately 3 days ago. He left a note, but they're not releasing the contents yet. They are treating his property as a potential crime scene. Raymond ended the call and stood in the gathering dusk, watching the farmhouse with its dark windows and sagging porch. 2 men had lived here, harboring a secret that had claimed at least 23 lives, over 40 years. They'd attended church, shopped in town, smiled and waved to neighbors, and beneath it all, they'd maintained chambers of horror where children were kept, studied, killed, and cataloged like specimens in a laboratory. The worst part was knowing that one child had survived. Somewhere out there, someone was living with the memories of this place, with the knowledge of what had happened in the darkness beneath the barn. Someone who'd been 10 years old when they'd finally escaped. The conference room at the sheriff's department smelled of burnt coffee and nervous sweat. Raymond sat at the head of the table, surrounded by FBI agents who'd arrived that morning from Omaha, along with Sheriff Miller and Dr. Marsh. A laptop displayed crime scene photos that Raymond wished he could unsee. Special Agent Marcus Webb, a man in his 40s with graying temples and permanent worry lines, led the briefing. Thomas Mercer's suicide note was 8 pages long. Most of it is confession, detailing his and his father's activities from 1979 to 1987. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I'll summarize the relevant points. Webb clicked to a new slide, showing a photograph of Harrison Mercer from the 1960s, distinguished-looking white coat, stethoscope around his neck, every inch the respected small-town doctor. Harrison Mercer believed he could identify and correct behavioral abnormalities in children through a combination of isolation, controlled stimulation, and what he called corrective conditioning. In layman's terms, torture. He started with runaways and children of migrant workers, people whose disappearances wouldn't be noticed or investigated thoroughly. The earliest samples we found in that underground room date to 1953. Raymond did the math. 34 years of victims before the Mercer cousins. How many children had died beneath that barn while the town went about its business above? Thomas claims he didn't know about his father's activities until 1979, when he discovered the tunnels by accident, Webb continued. By that point, Harrison was 72, and according to Thomas, beginning to show signs of dementia. Thomas didn't go to the police. Instead, he began assisting his father, initially, he claims, to keep Harrison from making mistakes that would expose them both. He's lying, Raymond said flatly. The modifications to those tunnels, the separate chambers, the preservation methods for the samples, that's sophisticated work done over several years. Thomas wasn't just an assistant, he was a partner. Webb nodded. Our forensic psychologist agrees. The note is a masterpiece of deflection and self-justification. Thomas paints himself as a victim of his father's madness, trapped by circumstance. The reality, based on the evidence, is that he was an enthusiastic participant. Another slide appeared, this one showing the Polaroid photographs they'd found in the metal box. Raymond looked away. He'd seen them enough times. The children were kept alive for varying periods, Webb said, his voice clinically detached, in the way of someone forcing themselves not to feel. The first 3 victims during the reunion incident were killed within 6 months. Michael Turner, age 7, was the first. Danny Mitchell, age 10, was second. Emma Pierce, age 9, was third. Sarah Holcomb, age 12, survived for nearly a year before she escaped. The room went silent. Raymond's head snapped up. "What did you say?" Webb met his eyes. Sarah Holcomb escaped in June of 1988. According to Thomas's note, she somehow picked the lock on her cell door, made it through the tunnels, and got out through the barn. They searched for her for weeks, but never found her. Harrison wanted to report her escape anonymously, create a false witness to say they'd seen her in another state, but Thomas convinced him that would draw too much attention. They decided to wait it out, banking on the assumption that a traumatized 12-year-old wouldn't or couldn't tell anyone what had happened. "She's been alive all this time," Dr. Marsh whispered. "For 35 years, she's been out there somewhere." Thomas claims he looked for her periodically over the years. Webb continued. "Not to harm her, he insists, but to, quote, ensure she was coping adequately." He never found her. No missing persons report was ever filed for a Sarah Holcomb beyond the original 1987 report. She either changed her identity or she's been hiding in plain sight, Raymond finished. He pulled out his phone and called Jenny. "I need everything we have on Sarah Holcomb. School records, medical records, any documentation of her life before the disappearance. And I need you to run a search on every woman currently aged 48 to 50 who moved to Nebraska between 1988 and 1990. Cross-reference with women who have no documented history before that time frame." "Dad, that could be hundreds of people." "Start with the Ashford area. Expand outward." Raymond hung up and looked at Webb. "She came back. I'd bet everything I have that she came back." "Why would she do that?" Sheriff Miller asked. "Why return to the place where she was held captive?" "Because she's watching," Raymond said, certainty settling over him like a familiar coat. "She's been watching the Mercer property for 35 years, making sure nobody else got taken. Think about it. The farm sat abandoned for 2 decades. No squatters, no vandals beyond surface-level graffiti, nothing. In a county where abandoned properties get stripped for copper wire and appliances within months, that farmhouse sat pristine. Someone was protecting it. Or guarding it," Dr. Marsh added, making sure the secret stayed buried. Webb pulled up another slide, this one showing an evidence bag containing a worn leather journal. "We found this in Thomas Mercer's home. It's Harrison's personal diary, documenting his experiments from 1953 to 1987. The entries are clinical, detailed, and completely devoid of empathy. But there's a section about Sarah Holcomb that I think you need to hear." He read from a tablet, presumably containing a transcription of the journal. Subject 7, female, age 12, demonstrates unprecedented resilience. Unlike previous subjects, she maintains behavioral autonomy despite extended conditioning protocols. Her psychological profile suggests adaptive survival mechanisms that warrant further study. She forms no attachment to captors, shows no signs of learned helplessness, maintains future-oriented thinking. "In 34 years of research, I have never encountered a subject with such innate resistance to systematic dehumanization. She will either die or escape. She cannot be broken." Raymond felt something shift in his chest, a combination of grief and admiration for a 12-year-old girl who'd endured 11 months of hell and emerged unbroken enough to pick a lock and run. "When did Thomas write his suicide note?" Webb checked his tablet. "We're estimating he wrote it over the course of a week. He killed himself 3 days ago, but the note references events from up to 10 days prior." "Why?" "Because someone told him the game was over," Raymond said. "The drought started exposing the creek bed 3 weeks ago. Thomas would have known what was buried there. He would have known it was only a matter of time before we found the bodies, before we found the tunnels. I think Sarah Holcomb contacted him. I think she told him she was going to make sure the truth came out, and Thomas decided he'd rather die than face what was coming. The room absorbed this theory in silence. Finally, Webb nodded slowly. It fits. Colorado PD found evidence that Thomas had a visitor the week before his death. A neighbor reported seeing a woman leaving his house, mid to late 40s, dark hair, driving a Honda sedan. We're pulling traffic cam footage from the area. Raymond's phone buzzed. Jenny's text read, "Found something. Call me now." He stepped out of the conference room into the hallway, the fluorescent lights harsh after the dim meeting room. "What have you got, Dad?" "I found Sarah Holcomb's medical records from 1986. She broke her left arm that fall, had it set at Harrison Mercer's clinic. The X-rays are still on file. If we can find a woman with the same healed break pattern." "Jenny, that's genius. But there's an easier way. Run a search for any woman in Nebraska who filed for a legal name change between 1988 and 1990, ages 12 to 14 at the time. Include a search for women who entered the foster system during that period with no prior history." The pieces were falling into place in Raymond's mind. A traumatized 12-year-old escapes from captivity. She can't go home because home is where she was taken. She can't tell anyone what happened because she's terrified they'll send her back. She's a child alone, probably injured, definitely traumatized. What would she do? She'd disappear into a system designed to lose people. She'd become someone else. And then, when she was old enough, strong enough, she'd come back to make sure it never happened to anyone else. "Found her," Jenny said, triumph in her voice. Sarah Holcomb entered the Colorado foster system in July 1988, claiming she'd run away from an abusive home in California. She gave a false name, Stephanie Hayes. She was placed with a family in Boulder, aged out of the system at 18. And then the trail goes cold until 1995, when a Stephanie Hayes enrolled at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. Dad, Stephanie Hayes currently lives in Ashford. She's a librarian at the county library. Raymond's hand tightened on his phone. The county library sat exactly 2 miles from the old Mercer Farm. Close enough to watch, close enough to know if anyone went near that property, close enough to see when the drought finally revealed what had been hidden in the creek bed. "Get me her address," Raymond said. "And Jenny, don't send anyone else. I'm going alone." The county library occupied a converted brick building that had once been the town's train station. Stephanie Hayes lived in a modest bungalow 3 blocks away, a location Raymond verified from the address Jenny had provided. He sat in his truck across the street as evening settled over Ashford, watching lights come on inside the small house. He'd driven past this house countless times over the years, had probably seen its owner in passing at the grocery store or post office. The thought that Sarah Holcomb had been living 2 miles from the Mercer Farm for nearly 30 years, invisible in her ordinariness, made his skin crawl. Not because she'd hidden, but because she'd had to. Raymond climbed out of the truck and crossed the street, his boots heavy on the cracked sidewalk. The house had neat flower beds, painted shutters, a porch swing that moved slightly in the evening breeze. Normal. Aggressively, determinedly normal. He knocked on the door, his badge ready in his hand, though he was no longer obligated to carry it. The door opened after a moment, revealing a woman of medium height, with dark hair cut short, glasses perched on her nose, wearing jeans and a cardigan despite the summer heat. She looked at the badge, then at his face, and Raymond saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition. Relief, maybe. Or perhaps resignation. Detective Cole, she said quietly. Not a question. She'd known this day would come. Miss Hayes, or should I call you Sarah? She stepped back from the door, gesturing him inside. Stephanie is fine. I've been her longer than I was ever Sarah. The interior of the house was as carefully normal as the exterior. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with worn paperbacks and hardcovers. A cat lounged on the sofa, watching Raymond with suspicious yellow eyes. Through a doorway he could see a kitchen, with dishes drying by the sink. Stephanie moved to an armchair and sat, folding her hands in her lap. Raymond remained standing, unsure how to begin a conversation 35 years in the making. You found the tunnels, Stephanie said, sparing him the need to start. I saw the police presence at the farm. I knew it was only a matter of time once the drought exposed the creek bed. You've been watching the property. Every day for 28 years. She looked at him directly, her eyes steady behind her glasses. Since I came back to Ashford. Before that, I checked periodically when I could. I needed to make sure nobody else went missing. Nobody else got taken to that place. Raymond finally sat, perching on the edge of the sofa beside the cat, who hissed softly. Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you tell someone what happened? Stephanie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. I was 12 years old when I escaped. 11 months in that darkness, watching the others die one by one. By the time I got out, I was more feral than human. I couldn't speak for weeks, couldn't bear to be touched, couldn't sleep indoors without having panic attacks. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. I hitched rides to Colorado, lived on the streets for 2 months before social services picked me up. I gave them a fake name, a fake history. I was terrified that if I told the truth, they'd send me back, send me home. And home was where it happened, Detective. Home was where people who were supposed to protect me let 4 children walk into a field and vanish. Your mother, Raymond began. My mother believed I was dead. Stephanie cut him off, her voice sharp. I saw her on TV once, a few months after I escaped. She was pleading for information, begging whoever had taken me to let me come home. And I almost called her, almost. She turned from the window. But I was 12 and traumatized, and convinced that somehow it had been my fault. That if I'd been smarter, braver, better, I could have saved the others. Could have stopped it before Michael died, before Danny, before Emma. I couldn't face her knowing I'd survived and they hadn't. Raymond thought of Margaret Holcomb, who died 6 years ago, according to the records Jenny had pulled. She'd never known her daughter had survived. The weight of that knowledge settled on him like a physical thing. When did you realize about Harrison and Thomas? He asked. Not for years, Stephanie admitted. When I was 18, I started digging through newspaper archives, police reports, anything I could find about the disappearances. I recognized Harrison's voice, his face from the photos. He'd visited the tunnels regularly, but I'd never seen clearly enough in the dark to identify him. Thomas I never saw at all. He stayed upstairs, in the house. But once I knew Harrison was involved, it was easy to connect him to the property, to Thomas. She moved to another bookshelf, pulling down a thick binder. She handed it to Raymond, who opened it to find pages and pages of documentation. Newspaper clippings, printed articles, handwritten notes, tracking Harrison Mercer's movements from 1953 to his death. It was the work of decades, of obsession. I've documented everything, Stephanie said. Every missing child case in Nebraska, from 1950 to 1990. Every unsolved disappearance. I've cross-referenced locations, dates, victims. I've created a map of Harrison's movements, his hunting patterns. There are 43 cases I believe can be attributed to him and Thomas, 43 children who vanished and were never found. Raymond stared at the binder, at the meticulous work of a survivor-turned-investigator. Why didn't you bring this to the police? Because I had no proof, Stephanie said simply. Just theories and suspicions built on the memories of a traumatized child. Who would have believed me? Harrison was a respected doctor. Thomas was a productive member of the community. I was a nobody, a foster kid with a fake identity and no credentials. So I waited. I watched. I made sure Thomas never took another child. And I waited for the day when the earth itself would give up the proof I couldn't provide. You visited Thomas in Colorado, Raymond said. A week before he killed himself? Stephanie nodded. I told him the drought was exposing the creek bed, that police would find the bodies soon, that his father's secrets were about to become public knowledge. I told him he had a choice, face justice or take the coward's way out. He chose. That's not justice, Raymond said quietly. No, Stephanie agreed, but it's closure. And for me, for what I've lived with for 35 years, that's enough. Raymond closed the binder, his hands resting on its cover. There are families who need closure too. Parents who need to know what happened to their children. They deserve to know the truth. They deserve better than the truth, Stephanie said, her voice breaking slightly. They deserve a world where men like Harrison Mercer don't exist, where children don't vanish into darkness. But that's not the world we have. So yes, tell them. Tell them everything. Show them the tunnels, the samples, the photographs. Let them know their children didn't run away or get lost. Let them know their children were murdered by a monster who smiled at them in the grocery store. She sat back down, suddenly looking exhausted. I'll cooperate with the investigation fully. I'll identify what I can, testify if needed. But detective, I need you to understand something. The girl who walked into that cornfield in 1987, Sarah Holcomb, she died in those tunnels. The woman sitting in front of you, Stephanie Hayes, she's someone else. Someone who was forged in that darkness and spent 35 years making sure nobody else had to experience it. Don't ask me to be Sarah again. I can't. She's gone. Raymond stood slowly, his knees protesting. He looked at this woman who'd survived the unsurvivable, who'd turned her trauma into purpose, who'd spent decades watching over a town that had failed to protect her. Miss Hayes, he said formally, I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. We'll need everything in that binder, everything you remember about the layout of the tunnels, and anything you can tell us about other potential victims. Stephanie nodded. I'll be there at 9. Raymond walked to the door, then paused. Your mother, Margaret. She never stopped looking for you. She died believing you were gone, but she never stopped hoping. I think you should know that. Stephanie's face remained impassive, but Raymond saw her hands tighten on the arms of the chair. Thank you for telling me. Outside, the night had fully settled over Ashford. Raymond sat in his truck for a long moment before starting the engine. Somewhere in the darkness, the Mercer Farm sat with its secrets finally exposed. In the county morgue, bones waited to be identified and returned to families who'd mourned for decades. And in the small bungalow behind him, a woman who'd died at 12 and been reborn at 13 sat alone with her memories, and her vigil finally ended. The sheriff's department conference room was packed the next morning. Stephanie sat at one end of the table, the binder open in front of her, facing Raymond, Sheriff Miller, FBI Agent Webb, and a trauma counselor the FBI had insisted on bringing. A court reporter sat in the corner, fingers poised over her stenography machine. Stephanie's testimony began at 9:15 and continued for 6 hours. She spoke in a measured, clinical tone, describing the tunnels, the chambers, the daily routine of captivity. She identified the other 3 children from the photographs, confirmed the timeline of their deaths, and detailed everything she could remember about Harrison Mercer's visits to the underground complex. "He came twice a week," she said, her voice steady. "Tuesdays and Fridays, usually in the evening. He brought food, water, medical supplies. He would examine each of us, take notes in a leather journal. Sometimes he'd conduct tests, memory exercises, behavioral assessments. He called it research. He said we were helping him understand how children adapt to controlled environments." "Did he ever explain why he was doing this?" Webb asked. Stephanie shook her head. "Not directly. But I heard him talking to Thomas once, through the ventilation shaft. Harrison said something about his brother, how Eugene had been weak, how the family line needed strengthening. He believed he could identify weakness in children and either correct it or eliminate it. In his mind, he wasn't murdering children. He was conducting research that would benefit future generations." Dr. Marsh, who'd been invited to sit in on the testimony, leaned forward. "The samples we found, the hair and blood and tissue, were they all collected from living subjects?" "Most of them," Stephanie confirmed. "Harrison was obsessed with documentation. He had a system for cataloging everything. Each child was assigned a subject number. We were 7, 8, 9, and 10. But the shelves went back much further. I saw labels for subject 1, 2, 3. Dozens of them." Raymond pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop, one that Jenny had compiled from the sample labels they'd found. "We've identified 23 distinct names from the samples. The earliest date we found was November 1953. A child named Peter Gaines, age 9. He was reported as a runaway from a migrant worker camp outside Ashford. The case was never solved." "There are more," Stephanie said quietly. "Harrison didn't always keep samples. Some of the earlier victims, before he refined his methods, he just disposed of. Thomas mentioned once that his father had been wasteful in the early years. I believe there are bodies we'll never find. Children who were taken before Harrison developed his cataloging obsession." The room absorbed this information in grim silence. Finally, Sheriff Miller spoke. "Miss Hayes, can you walk us through your escape? We need to understand how you got out and why the Mercers couldn't find you afterward." Stephanie took a breath, the first sign of emotional strain she'd shown all morning. "It was June 1988. I'd been captive for 11 months. Harrison's visits had become less frequent. He was 77, showing signs of confusion, sometimes forgetting he'd already fed us, or repeating the same tests multiple times. Thomas had started accompanying him, making sure he didn't make mistakes." She paused, gathering herself. "One evening, Thomas left the main chamber door unlocked. I don't know if it was deliberate or an oversight, but I heard the click of the lock not catching. I waited until I was certain they'd gone back upstairs. Then I pushed the door open. It took me 2 hours to navigate the tunnels in the dark. I knew there was a ladder somewhere. I'd heard them using it, but I had to find it by touch. When I got to the barn, it was night. I hid in the loft until morning, then waited until I saw Thomas leave in his truck. I ran across the fields to the county road and walked until a trucker picked me up. I told him I'd gotten lost on a camping trip. He drove me as far as Kearney, and from there, I hitched my way to Colorado." "Why Colorado?" Webb asked. "Far enough away to feel safe, close enough that I could come back when I was ready." Stephanie looked at Raymond. "I knew even then that someday I'd return, that I couldn't let the Mercers keep getting away with it. But I needed time to become strong enough, smart enough, invisible enough to watch them without being seen. Raymond pulled out another file, this one containing property records and surveillance reports from the past 3 decades. You bought the house 3 blocks from the library in 1995. You've worked at the county library since 1997. Every day you've had a clear line of sight to anyone traveling toward the Mercer property. Not just watching, Stephanie corrected, acting. 3 times over the years, I saw suspicious activity near the farm. People exploring, teenagers looking for a place to party. I called it in anonymously each time, claimed I'd seen trespassers. Sheriff's department would send a deputy out, and the interlopers would leave. I made sure that property stayed abandoned, stayed untouched, until the time was right. The drought, Dr. Marsh said. You knew it would expose the creek bed. I hoped it would, Stephanie admitted. Climate data suggested this summer would be unusually dry. I'd been monitoring the creek levels for months. When I saw the water dropping, exposing the creek bed, I knew it was time. That's when I went to Colorado to see Thomas. Webb typed something on his laptop, then looked up. Colorado PD found a recording device in Thomas Mercer's living room. Hidden camera, audio surveillance. Did you plant that? Stephanie met his gaze steadily. Yes. I needed his confession documented. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed or denied. The recording is on a secure server, along with copies of everything in that binder. If anything had happened to me, if Thomas had tried to silence me, the information would have been released automatically. That's conspiracy to commit surveillance crimes, Sheriff Miller said. I know, Stephanie replied. Arrest me if you want. I'll plead guilty. But you have Thomas's confession now, recorded and documented. You have 43 cases that can finally be solved. 43 families who can finally know the truth. Was my crime worse than letting them go on wondering for the rest of their lives? Raymond closed his laptop. Nobody's arresting you, Ms. Hayes. But we do need that recording, and we need access to whatever other evidence you've compiled over the years. Stephanie reached into her bag and pulled out a thumb drive. Everything's on here. Thomas's confession, my investigative notes, documentation of every case I believe can be connected to Harrison Mercer. There's also information about potential associates. Harrison didn't work entirely alone. He had help disposing of bodies, maintaining the tunnels, acquiring some of the children. I've identified 3 individuals who I believe were complicit. She slid the thumb drive across the table. 2 are dead. The third, a man named Robert Ashton, currently lives in Grand Island. He was Harrison's medical assistant from 1965 to 1979. He's 78 years old now, probably has dementia, but he might be able to provide additional information about the early victims. Webb pocketed the thumb drive. We'll follow up on every lead. Ms. Hayes, I want to be clear about something. What you've done, the surveillance, the decades of investigation, it's not legal. But it's also not something we're going to prosecute. You've provided us with evidence that will solve multiple cold cases and bring closure to families who've waited decades for answers. The Bureau is prepared to offer you immunity in exchange for your continued cooperation. Stephanie nodded slowly. I'll cooperate fully. But I have one condition. What's that? Raymond asked. I want to be there when you excavate the rest of the creek bed. I need to see it through to the end. I owe that to the others, to Danny and Emma and Michael, to all 43 children whose names are in that binder. I survived, and they didn't. The least I can do is bear witness when they're finally brought home. The excavation of Mercer Creek took 3 weeks. The drought continued through September, the creek bed cracking further under relentless sun, revealing more than anyone had anticipated. By the time they finished, Dr. Marsh's team had recovered the remains of 19 children from the dried mud and limestone. Stephanie was there every day, standing at the edge of the excavation site in jeans and a wide-brimmed hat, watching as each small bone was carefully unearthed, photographed, and catalogued. Raymond watched her from a distance, noting how she never looked away, never flinched, even when they uncovered the smallest remains, children no older than 5 or 6. On the 18th day, they found something that made Dr. Marsh call Raymond over immediately. He approached the excavation pit, where she knelt beside a partially exposed skeleton, this one larger than the others, clearly an adult. Male, approximately 6 feet tall, age at death between 30 and 40, Dr. Marsh said, carefully brushing soil from the skull. Raymond, look at this. She indicated the skeletal hands, which were positioned strangely, the bones of the fingers broken and healed at odd angles. Defensive wounds, old ones, healed years before death. And look here. She pointed to the skull, where a clear depression marked the bone. Blunt force trauma. This is what killed him. Who is it? Raymond asked, though something in the back of his mind was already forming a theory. Dr. Marsh carefully extracted a rotted leather wallet from the remains' clothing. Inside was a driver's license, the plastic warped, but the photo still visible. Raymond stared at the face of a man he'd never met, but had read about extensively in the past 3 weeks. Eugene Mercer, Harrison's brother, the one who'd been institutionalized in 1953 for claiming his brother was conducting experiments. He didn't die in the institution, Raymond said slowly. Harrison checked him out, brought him here, and killed him. Looks that way. Dr. Marsh examined the bones more closely. Time of death is difficult to pinpoint precisely, but based on decomposition and the surrounding soil composition, I'd estimate late 1960s, possibly 1967 or 1968, right around the time the institution reported his death from pneumonia. Raymond looked toward where Stephanie stood watching them. She was too far away to hear their conversation, but she seemed to sense something significant had been found. She started walking toward them, her expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Hayes," Raymond called as she approached. "Did Thomas or Harrison ever mention Eugene Mercer, Harrison's brother?" Stephanie stopped at the edge of the pit, looking down at the adult skeleton. "Thomas mentioned him once. He said Eugene had tried to stop Harrison in the 1950s, that he'd threatened to expose everything. Harrison had him committed, then visited him regularly at the institution. Thomas said his father considered it a mercy when Eugene finally died." She paused, studying the remains. "I'm guessing Eugene didn't die of natural causes." "No," Dr. Marsh confirmed. "He was murdered, probably in the late 1960s. Harrison must have falsified the death certificate at the institution, then disposed of the body here." Stephanie nodded slowly, no surprise in her expression. "Harrison always said that weakness had to be eliminated, even in adults, especially in family. He considered Eugene's conscience a genetic defect that needed to be removed from the bloodline." Over the following days, they expanded the excavation, finding 2 more adult bodies. DNA testing would later identify them as Harrison's medical assistant, Robert Ashton, whom Stephanie had mentioned, and a woman named Carol Winters, who'd worked as a nurse at Harrison's clinic in the 1970s. Both had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their cases filed away as voluntary missing persons. The picture that emerged, was of a man who'd spent 4 decades murdering anyone who threatened to expose his activities. Children were his primary victims, his research subjects, but adults who discovered his secrets met the same fate, their bodies buried in the creek bed, alongside the children they'd tried to save or simply stumbled upon. By late September, the excavation was complete. 22 bodies total, 19 children and 3 adults. DNA testing was underway to identify the remains, matching them to the names in Stephanie's binder and to missing persons cases going back 70 years. On the final day of excavation, Raymond stood beside Stephanie at the creek bed, now looking more like an archaeological dig than a crime scene. The sun was setting, painting the Nebraska sky in shades of orange and purple. Workers were packing up equipment, preparing to close the site. 22, Stephanie said quietly. 22 people murdered and hidden here. And these are just the ones the drought exposed. How many more are out there, in other creeks, other fields, places we'll never think to look? Raymond didn't have an answer. The investigation had expanded beyond Ashford, beyond Nebraska. The FBI was coordinating with law enforcement agencies across 6 states, following the trail of Harrison Mercer's career, his travels, his unexplained absences. The final count might be 50 victims. It might be 100. You did everything you could, Raymond told her. You survived, and you made sure the truth came out. Those families have answers now, because of you. Stephanie turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw tears in her eyes. I should have come forward sooner. I should have told someone, anyone. What happened? Maybe if I had, some of these children could have been saved. You were 12 years old, Raymond said firmly. Traumatized, alone, terrified. You survived, and that was enough. Everything you've done since then, that's been extraordinary. But you don't owe anyone your trauma. You don't owe anyone your pain. I owe them the truth, Stephanie replied. And now, they have it. They stood in silence as the last of the workers departed, leaving the creek bed empty and exposed under the darkening sky. Tomorrow, the site would be officially closed, the area cordoned off as a memorial. The town council had already voted to purchase the Mercer property from the current owners, with plans to create a memorial park dedicated to the victims. The farmhouse would be demolished. The barn would be torn down. The tunnels would be filled with concrete, sealed forever. But the memory of what happened there would remain, a scar on the landscape and on the community that had unknowingly harbored a monster for 4 decades. What will you do now? Raymond asked Stephanie. She considered the question for a long moment. I don't know. For 35 years, I've had a purpose, watching, waiting, documenting. Now that purpose is fulfilled, I'm not sure who Stephanie Hayes is without that mission. Maybe it's time to find out, Raymond suggested gently. Maybe it's time to stop being the guardian and just be yourself. Stephanie smiled, a small, sad expression. Maybe. But whoever I am, whatever I do next, I'll never forget them. The ones who didn't make it out. I carry them with me always. As they walked back to their vehicles, Raymond looked back one last time at the creek bed, at the place where secrets had been buried and finally unearthed. The drought would eventually end. Rain would return, filling the creek, covering the exposed limestone. Life would continue. But the truth, once revealed, could never be buried again. 6 months after the discovery at Mercer Creek, Raymond Cole stood in the Ashford Community Center, surrounded by photographs and flowers and the quiet murmur of voices. The memorial service had drawn people from across the country, families who'd spent decades wondering about missing children, finally able to lay them to rest. DNA analysis had identified 16 of the 19 children found in the creek bed. 3 remained unidentified, their names lost to time and incomplete records, but they were remembered here too, acknowledged and mourned. Sarah Holcomb's photograph sat on a table near the entrance, placed there by Raymond himself. Beneath it, a small placard read, Sarah Holcomb, 1975 to 1987. Survived by her mother, Margaret Holcomb. May she rest in peace. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Stephanie Hayes had requested that Sarah remain officially dead, her survival known only to law enforcement. She needed the anonymity, needed the protection of her assumed identity to build whatever life came next. Raymond understood. Some truths were too heavy to be made public. The memorial service concluded with a prayer and the reading of names, each child acknowledged individually, no longer just a missing person's case number, but a person remembered. As the crowd dispersed, Raymond noticed a woman standing alone, near the back of the room. Dark hair, glasses, wearing a simple black dress. Stephanie had come, despite her reservations, despite the risk of being recognized. She caught his eye and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. Then she turned and slipped out the side door, disappearing into the March afternoon. Raymond never saw her again. Over the following months, the investigation continued to expand. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit determined that Harrison Mercer had likely murdered between 48 and 65 people over his 40-year killing spree, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Most of his victims had been children, but at least a dozen adults who discovered his activities had met the same fate. Thomas Mercer's suicide note, combined with Harrison's journals and Stephanie's documentation, allowed investigators to solve 29 cold cases definitively. Another 14 cases were classified as probable but unconfirmed. The remaining victims would likely never be identified, their bodies lost to time and the vast Nebraska landscape. Robert Ashton, Harrison's former medical assistant, was found incompetent to stand trial due to advanced dementia. He died in a nursing home 4 months after his arrest. His last coherent words, a confession that he'd helped Harrison dispose of bodies in the 1970s because he'd been afraid of becoming one himself. The Mercer property was demolished in April. The farmhouse, the barn, even the foundation were removed. The tunnels were filled with concrete, and the entire area was capped with clean soil. By summer, grass was growing over the site, and construction had begun on a memorial park featuring a reflecting pool and a wall bearing the names of the identified victims. Jenny called Raymond in late August with news. "Dad, remember how we couldn't find any trace of Stephanie Hayes after 1995? Well, I just got a hit on her name. She sold her house in Ashford 3 months ago. No forwarding address, no indication of where she went. It's like she vanished." Raymond wasn't surprised. Stephanie Hayes had served her purpose, had seen the truth revealed, and the victims remembered. Now she was doing what she'd done at 12 years old, disappearing, reinventing herself, moving forward in whatever way she could. He hoped she found peace wherever she'd gone, hoped she could finally put down the burden she'd carried for 35 years. On a cool October morning, Raymond drove out to the new memorial park. The construction was complete, the reflecting pool filled with clear water, the names etched in black granite, gleaming in the autumn sun. He walked slowly along the wall, reading each name, remembering the photographs he'd studied, the families he'd spoken with, the lives cut short by a monster who'd hidden behind the respectable facade of a small-town doctor. At the end of the wall, in smaller letters, was an additional inscription. "And for those whose names we do not know, but whose lives mattered, you are not forgotten." Raymond stood before the wall for a long time, thinking about Sarah Holcomb, who became Stephanie Hayes, who became someone else entirely. Thinking about the 12-year-old girl who'd survived 11 months in darkness and emerged with enough strength to spend 35 years ensuring no one else suffered the same fate. She'd saved lives, even if she'd never know how many. By watching the Mercer property, by keeping people away, by waiting for the moment when the truth could finally emerge, she'd prevented Harrison and Thomas from claiming more victims in their final years. That was heroism, even if it would never be publicly acknowledged. As Raymond walked back to his truck, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for believing me, for listening, for seeing Sarah not as a victim, but as a survivor. She's at peace now. We both are." S. Raymond typed a reply. "You gave those families closure they'd waited decades for. You gave those children justice. Thank you for your courage." The message showed as delivered, but was never read. The number was disconnected when he tried to call it an hour later. Stephanie Hayes had disappeared one final time, taking Sarah Holcomb with her into whatever future she'd chosen to build. Raymond hoped it was a good one, a peaceful one, far from the cornfields and creek beds of Ashford, Nebraska. The town itself slowly healed, the way communities do after having their darkest secrets exposed. The memorial park became a place of quiet reflection, visited by families and school groups and people who simply needed to acknowledge that evil had existed here and had finally been defeated. Raymond retired for the second time that December, his last case finally, truly closed. On his final day, he drove past the memorial park one more time. The reflecting pool caught the winter sunlight, throwing prisms of light across the wall of names. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, riding the cold wind. Life continued. It always did, but the children would be remembered, and the woman who'd survived would carry their memory forward, wherever she'd gone, whatever name she now called herself. That would have to be enough.